Oral History Program, Tuesday, October 3rd, 1972. And I'm going to interview this gentleman in his home. And your name, please.
Magner Sr.
Mr. Magner, where were you born and the date?
I was born in Joliet, Illinois on the 14th of August, 1894.
And your mother and father, your parents, and your mother's maiden name and your father's occupation.
My mother's maiden name was Anna Louise Woelfel. And my father was at the time I was born, he was a teller in a bank in Joliet, Illinois.
What was his background before he became a banker?
Well, he had just finished 6 years at Wabash College, 2 years in the preparatory department, and 4 years in the regular academic department. He played on the first Wabash College football team with the champions of Indiana in 1886.
Good. Now, how about your grandparents? Do you remember either your paternal or your maternal grandparents and who they were and the backgrounds on them?
Well, of course, I knew my father's mother and father quite well. They lived to be quite elderly. And my mother's mother, I knew her quite well. My grandfather, Woelfel, however, had died when I was only about a year and a half old. He had started a tannery in Morris, Illinois, quite successful. And the family ran it from then on until it finally closed up later on.
And on your father's side, your grandparents on your father's side?
You mean my father's father and mother?
Right.
Well, my father's father had just finished the term during the Civil War. Under Ulysses S. Grant, he finally became a captain in the U.S. Signal Corps. And when he got home, he was so impressed with all the fighting and so on, he thought he ought to do something, and he decided to become a Presbyterian minister. In those days, you preached before some other Presbyterian ministers, and when they thought you were ready, well, they turned you loose on your own, and that's how he got started. He didn't have any background in a divinity school, any of that kind that's required today. My grandmother, he had one of the first pupils in school. Before he went to the Army, he had a school in Paris, Illinois. And one of the students in the class was my grandmother. I think she's 8 years younger than he was. But later when he went to the Civil War, he asked her to come down to the station in Mississippi. And they were married, and I think she stayed down there nearly a year with him while he taught signaling in a Union Corps school down there in Mississippi. Funny thing about it, it's probably very close to where I was located when I was in Mississippi in World War I.
How many children did your parents have?
My parents had 6 children. I was the oldest, and my brother Morris was the youngest, and there were 4 girls in between.
In other words, there were 2 boys and 4 girls.
Yeah.
What are your earliest recollections of life in Illinois that would be prior to the turn of the century?
Well, I expect my first impression that I remember was a tannery that my grandfather had started, caught on fire. And my mother and I went down. I think I was only, 2 or 3 years old. I remember the commotion, and my father was overcome with smoke. And they took him home in a wagon. My mother and I went with him. And the doctor came up the house to see what was wrong, and found my father going back down to the tannery again to see if he could extinguish the fire.
What age did you start the grade school then?
Well, I started when I was 7 years old. I started really when I was 6, but I had some common disease, and I was out of school so much I didn't even start till I was 7 years old. I started in Morris, Illinois. That was hometown. My grandfather did Presbyterian minister there, and after being ministered in 4 or 5 other small towns in Illinois, he finally settled in Morris, Illinois. That's up near Joliet, about 20 miles from Joliet on the Illinois River.
Was this a one-room schoolhouse, and how many students?
No, it was a 2-room schoolhouse. It had a lower floor with the 1st and 2nd grade in it, and an upper floor with the 3rd and 4th grade in it. And I went there for the first 4 years of school and had a big heating stove in the back of the room that heated the whole room. As I remember, did a pretty good job. And a hallway out and a stairway way out on the south side.
What was a typical school day like in Morris, Illinois? Time that you went to school and the subjects that you took and your lunch hour and games that you played?
Well, we went home for dinner. We called it dinner in those days, I guess. And we had a recess in the middle of the morning and middle of the afternoon. And as I remember, one of the favorite games we played at recess was cowboys and cows. Someone would act like cows, put sticks on their hat, and the rest of them would act as cowboys, round us up, put us in a pen in the back of the yard. I don't remember too much about our class except the spelling class. We'd line up on Friday afternoon and have a spelling contest, and if you missed, you went down to the bottom of the line and worked yourself up. Some of the girls naturally were usually at the head of the line most of the time.
A man teacher or a lady teacher?
Lady teacher. There weren't very many men teachers in those days. In fact, I don't know of any men teachers. The superintendent of schools was a man, but all the rest of them were women teachers.
How long was the school year?
I think it was 9 months, about, as I recall, probably started in September and ended in 1st of June, somewhere along in there.
Did we cover the subjects that you took in the primary grade?
Did we do what?
Have we covered the subjects that you...
I suppose you have reading and writing and spelling and arithmetic, and that was about it, I expect. I expect you had
geography, probably.
Yes, some geography.
After grade school, then, where did you go to high school and in what town?
Well, I went to the same town, Morris High School. It was about, I'd say it was at least a mile from where I lived. I lived in the west part of town, and the high school was past the center of town. And we went home at noon for dinner, and I remember I used to run most of the way home to get in trim for the track and athletic teams I belonged to. We revived 4 athletic projects that had been neglected for a long time. We had basketball and football, track, and baseball. And I played on all those teams, was captain of the basketball team. We didn't get that started about my senior year, as I remember.
What kind of a record did that basketball team have in those days, and what were some of the typical scores?
I've got a picture around here of that team. I've forgotten where it is, and I think some of the scores for the whole game were as low as 6 points, and probably as high as 20 points for the winner. We always went back to the center to start each series. You didn't do like they do today, you know.
Not taking it in from out of bounds under the basket, you go back to the jump center.
To center every time. That slowed the game up a good deal. I don't remember how long the quarters and halves were. But we had a lot of fun. We played a lot of the teams around in that part of Indiana or Illinois. Didn't have a very big crowd watch the games. We practiced in a little building in a amusement park. You had to be careful that you didn't run into the cast iron stove in the corner of the room. And half the time you carry the ball off the ceiling in order to get into the basket. There wasn't complete room for the backboard of the basketball. Then we got in a big gymnasium, like up at Aurora. We went to a tournament up there. And the floor was so big that in the first few minutes we were all out of breath and weren't able to do much playing after that.
Where did you play your home games then in Morris?
We didn't play any home games. We didn't have a place to play home. We played them all away from home. The little school around there had some kind of a gymnasium fixed up. Usually it was let's see. I guess we played in the Opera House. They set up baskets down in the front where the floor was flat. And we played down there. That was on the second floor. And basketball wasn't very well organized in those days. That was back around 1909 to 1913, somewhere along in there.
Phil, were there any other sports activities at Morris High School back in the days that you were a student there?
Well, we had the four sports. We had track in the spring, and we had football in the fall, and we played baseball in the late spring. I think I played center on all the teams that there was any centers to be played. And my favorite thing in the athletic line was the high jump and the 50 and 100-yard dash. I got so I could do pretty well with those.
Well, in your high school career then, what year did you graduate and how many were in the class? And was there anything that really sticks in your mind about your high school days at Morris?
Well, that covers a lot of territory. The years seem to be quite long. I don't know why a school year seems long to a student. Today, it looks like these youngsters don't go more about a third or fourth of the time we used to. It's about the same time, though. I don't remember anything special about school, except I look forward to taking physics especially. And when I got into it, I did a lot of drawing and really worked at it in a good style. My experience in English was not very satisfactory. We had, I think, 6 different teachers in 4 years' time. And I found when I got to college that I couldn't spell. So I bought a dictionary and got busy using the dictionary, and I've used it ever since. I remember I had the Latin class. I took 3 years of Latin. And I found out soon that about 2/3 of the class were using ponies, and the rest of us were doing it like we're supposed to do it. As a result, I didn't get very good grades in Latin, but I took 3 years of it anyway. I didn't get very good grades in English because the teachers we had were inexperienced and the discipline was not very good. But in all other courses, I did quite well. I think I had around a 92 average for 4 years' time in high school.
Well, we were ready to graduate now, and your class year would have been what?
My class was the class of 1913. And since my father had gone to Wabash College and had graduated there, he thought that was a place for me. He thought I was too young to go to a large school like University of Illinois or Purdue. I wanted to go to Purdue, really. But he induced me to go to Wabash. Said, you can go there a couple of years, and at the end of 2 years, if you want to change to Purdue, why, of course, you can change. But at 2 years, I had joined a fraternity and was head of the fraternity, and very well wrapped up in all the college activities at Wabash College, so I didn't have any inclination to change schools at all. And down there, I came pretty close to making Phi Beta Kappa. I lacked, I think, 0.6 of a point of making the proper score to make Phi Beta Kappa. I got English brushed up pretty well down there. We had an excellent professor, and he turned back my compositions with a few misspelled words, and I'd correct those, and when I did that, I'd misspell some other words. So I finally decided to use the dictionary and use it pretty thoroughly. I have used it ever since. He later went to Harvard University and stayed there until he finally retired.
Who was that?
Ronald Walter Brown was his name. He was an excellent teacher. Most of the teachers I had at Wabash were the old school, high type. The chemistry department was quite famous at that time. The graduates always had jobs waiting for them in the steel mills and industry. And I majored in physics, had 3 years of physics and 3 years of chemistry, 4 years of math, 2 years of English composition, and some psychology and economics and so on. I was kind of provoked to think when I got into economics my senior year, I had to take 1 year of it, and also psychology, that I missed out a lot by not having taken that course before that, because the material was so exciting, so interesting. Our professor in psychology was especially an interesting man. He had a very bad eye defect. He'd have to hold the book vertical instead of horizontal to read the pages, but when spring came on, he was quite in demand to give commencement addresses to high schools and colleges all over the Central West, and so he was gone a lot of the time. But I took notes on his lectures, and I think it was by far the most interesting, exciting course I ever took in school.
His name?
George H. Tapey was his name.
T-A-P?
T-A-P-Y.
T-A-P-Y. And at Wabash College now, you joined a fraternity, and did you meet any of the men that were later to become lifelong friends?
Oh, yes. I figured that I got to know the fellows in the fraternity better than I knew my own brother and sisters. You lived with them, and in the house, I belonged to the Phi Gamma Delta, and you got to know them very well. You roomed with 2 or 3 or 4 of them, maybe, and I really believe I knew those fellows better than some of the any other group of folks I ever met. In fact, one of them became my brother-in-law. I introduced my sister. He wanted a date for a prom, and I suggested he invite my sister down. Well, sure enough, soon after that, they became engaged, and that's Fred Van Buskirk of Rowan, Indiana, became my brother-in-law. And we used to have dances, so about 4 times a year. It was at the very small dances, we invited in some of the college widows from around town. I remember one time I had the principal of the high school. She had been my father's girl when he was in college down there, some 25, 26 years before. We had a great time together recalling old times. I think she later became the superintendent of schools in Crawfordsville. I've forgotten what her name was offhand. I'll think of it in a minute. Her last name was Wilson. I've forgotten what her first name was.
Phil, you have grandchildren now in college, and I know that you visit colleges where the grandchildren go to school. How would you contrast the children going to school today, the young men, the young ladies going to school today, as compared to Wabash College pre-World War I?
I don't think the character of children or people have changed through the years at all. I think probably it's better known because of newspapers and periodicals and our travel and so on. But I think the character of young folks is just the same as it always was. I don't think we've gone into any difficulty in regard to youngsters. I think it's just as hard to raise a youngster today as it was back in those days, and vice versa. And you had just as many failures in those days in business you have today. I can't see there's any difference in human behavior and character. And although some people seem to bemoan the fact that the old days were the good old days and the modern days are things are going to pieces, but I can't see that at all. My experience doesn't show that.
The 4 years that you were at Wabash College, did you have summer employment someplace?
Yeah, I went home. My grandfather had founded a tannery, employed about 360, 375 men, and I got a job there. I think I worked for 35, 40 cents an hour. Of course, I didn't have any skilled work, but later on, I worked with the maintenance crew, and that suited me fine because I learned to run the lathe and the drill press and to work in the blacksmith shop and do carpenting and masonry and electric wiring and so on, and little chemistry. So that was a part of the tanning business that I enjoyed principally. Although I knew someday I would probably inherit the job of being a tanner, but it so happened that there's so many in the family that that never happened. So I came to Wabash because my father thought maybe school teaching would be the thing for me to do rather than stay in the tannery.
Now we're jumping ahead. Give us your class year and then tell us what happened upon graduation.
My class at Wabash, the class of 1917, and the war was coming on. War had been declared by America in April 6th of 1917. And so we were quite a turmoil at Wabash College, especially the seniors. And President McIntosh would get up in chapel one morning and suggest that we seniors ought to get into the armed forces right away. Well, next morning he changed his viewpoint, and he thought we ought to stay until graduation in June. And he jumped around so much, we finally decided that we would enlist in the service and get in. So there was an engineering outfit out of Indianapolis being organized, 113th Engineers, and they came to Wabash and signed up dozens of seniors, juniors, and I joined that outfit. And I didn't know when we were going to be called on active duty, but I moved to Indianapolis and got a job at the Indianapolis Light and Heat. They were building a new switching house, and I got a job there as a helper of the electricians. And I think I worked there about a month when we were called active duty in World War I. We went to Louisville, Kentucky, and helped establish Camp Taylor down there. And that's where I first met my future wife. She was born just a few miles from my hometown over in Illinois, and her father thought I was getting kind of lonesome out of camp, so he invited me to come in. And I went in I put it off for several weeks. I didn't see any hurry about it. I finally went in one Sunday afternoon and visited with the old folks. They talked a little about the family, not very much. They had, I think, 8 children, but they didn't say anything about them at all. And I thought, well, about 3 o'clock, I guess I'll go back to camp. Oh, I said, don't be in a hurry. Hazel is getting, she'll be down in a few minutes. And of course, when Hazel showed up, why, it was love at first sight. I realized finally. And I stayed in camp. I spent about a month down there. And when I left, why, we decided to become engaged. I went back to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and went into a jewelry store and bought a small diamond engagement ring and sent it to her. I found out after she took it down to the jeweler's right away to see if it was a real diamond or not. When it came out of a box of candy. She told me that later years.
Now, you went from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and what was your Army career then? World War was on.
Well, and I was in an engineer outfit, and I was assigned to special duty, mapping reconnaissance party. We had the job of mapping the entire camp and artillery range. We had about 40 men in our detachment, and we had a second lieutenant in charge and a captain who came out occasionally, Captain Corlett. And somehow we weren't turning out maps as fast as we should be doing. And the colonel got quite insistent about there was something wrong. Well, I knew what was wrong. The lieutenant in charge of the party and the sergeants would go in a cornfield and play cards all day, and then the rest of us would do all the work. We weren't getting our work done. So I tipped off the captain what was going on, and so we formed a new surveying party, about 40 members, unknown to this other group. We were in a different part of the artillery range, and we started pouring maps in right away. And the colonel saw at once there was something wrong, and the lieutenant in charge of the first party was sent to federal prison for incompetence and broke up that party entirely. Well, kind of as a pay, maybe, and some kind of recompense to me, why I got to go to officers' candidate school on the basis of what I had known about reconnaissance. I found out some of the hobbies I had had in school and in high school were the means of my advancing in rank rather than some of the things that in the military. So I got to go to the first candidate school. I stayed 2 months. It was normally 90 days of duration. Stayed there long enough to get my commission as second lieutenant of engineers. And I was assigned to Camp Humphreys, Virginia. That's down near Washington, D.C. And as a training officer for incoming men down there. And soon after that, I was assigned as company commander of 250 Negroes. They were supposed to be combat engineers. I don't know what, the only fighting they could do was them themselves. I don't think they knew anything more about it. A third of them couldn't speak English. They spoke Creole French. They were from northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas. And some of those fellows had never had a pair of shoes on their feet before, and they had feet about number 15 shoes. And we had to make a special requisition to the quartermaster corps to go out and find size 15 shoes for those poor fellows. Well, I was assigned to take them overseas, and we went from Hattiesburg to camp up here in New York City.
Fort Dix?
I forgot the name of the camp. I'll think of it in a minute.
Rikers Island?
No, it's up on the it's fine.
No, we can fill that in.
That'll make you do it. Well, I took these men up there. We went by train from Camp Lee, Virginia, to New York City, and camped up there for a while. And right then, the flu epidemic was at its height, and they got us all out one night about midnight. We sat out on the pavement for an hour or so, waiting orders, and finally we got on our feet, got our packs put together, and went down to Alpine Landing. We went up the Hudson River and then slid down that high embankment along there, and got aboard a ferry boat waiting down the river for us. And we got aboard and went down, and at Hoboken, we got on board an ocean liner. It was the biggest ocean liner afloat at that time. It was the SS Fatherland, so-called. It had been the, it was the Fatherland was the name of the German ship. The German ship had just made one maiden voyage to New York, and the Germans knew that we'd probably take it over as a troop ship. So they took oxyacetylene torches and cut through the crankshaft in several places and put the caps back on so they wouldn't know it. But the Americans found it out and welded it back together and took it on a trail run down the Atlantic coast and made better speed than the Germans had ever made with it. Leviathan is what the American name for it. Was the SS Fatherland was the German name for that ship. We had about 13,000 men aboard as troops and 2,000 crew. And we zigzagged across the Atlantic and took 4.5 days, New York to Brest. Remarkable short time. Ordinarily, a troop convoy took 2 weeks to make the trip. The flu was at its height in those days, and about halfway across where I got the flu and had to stay in my bunk most of the time, they'd bring me one meal a day after dark. I was at an outside stateroom, and it was black as pitch in there. And they'd give me a tray full of something to eat. I'd try to fool around and eat. And when I get through, I'd put the thing out on the outside the door, with a silver tray with a silver teapot and sugar bowl and cream pitcher and all that sort of thing. And during the night, I'd hear that cream pitcher and sugar bowl rolling back down across the passageway. The ship would roll from one side to the other. It'd come clunk, 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 bang, and then clunk, 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 bang on the other side. We finally landed at Brest, and it was a terrible mud hole. But the Americans had taken railroad ties and covered the roads and so on. You could get around all right. But the men I had, these 250 Negroes I had never made their packs up except once. We got it put up together and never took it apart. They had an overcoat and shelter halves and underwear and ration cans and a can of tomatoes and all those things, a rifle and a bayonet and a cartridge belt, canteen and first aid kit. All that pack I expect weighed 35, 40 pounds. And once they got the thing put together, they never took it apart. They just left it together. And the first night, we landed at Brest about 8 o'clock in the morning, just a little after sunup. But the spies would see us unloading. Why, we didn't unload until after dark, and by that time it was just raining something awful. We went up to Polynesian barracks. Those were Napoleon's old barracks at Brest. Napoleon had used them in the old days. And they showed me where my company was supposed to stay, and I could see in the light in a potato field, and you could see the rows of water down through the rows of potatoes. And they said, "That's where you're to camp tonight." I said, "Oh my gosh, what in the world?" So the fellows pitched their tents. They put their rifles down, whatever they could under to keep them out of the water, and somehow got their pup tents put up. I don't think they'd ever put up tents before. I never had seen them before. But somehow they got there and got some kind of sleep. And I was in the hospital for, I think, 6 days. When I got out, I went over to see what the place looked like. And they'd moved them into wooden barracks by that time, but all the old stuff that was left behind had been gathered up in blankets and shelter halves, and there were rifles and bayonets and shoes and just everything in a great big puddle. And we gathered that up and tried to get it back to the men it belonged to, and they had an awful time ever getting that thing straightened out. I guess we finally got it straightened out all right. And we finally went from there to Angers, an engineer camp, and the barracks there were some that Napoleon had used in the old days. And I only stayed there about a week. I was detached from my outfit and was given orders to report up the front lines. At that time, the front lines were up in the Meuse-Argonne. They didn't tell me how to get up there. They just said, you get up there and join the 107th Engineers. So there's 5 or 6 of us, so we all started on our own. We stopped at Paris stayed one night in Paris and got a square meal at one of the hotels there. Bread was rationed. If you didn't have bread ration tickets, you couldn't do any bread, but the waiters had to put extra rolls and piece of bread in the back end of the silver chest along the wall, and they got those out for us, and we got a pretty good square meal. So we got on aboard a troop train and went up to got up to the front lines, and as we went up, we heard people saying that the war was about over, that, of course, that was good news. And I got up to Verdun, city of Verdun, and stayed one night there. And the 14-inch Navy guns that belonged to the Americans were firing on nets and on the railroad yards. And we had and every time those guns would fire, the little boxcar end just shake like somebody, like an earthquake had hit it. But we finally went on up to the Meuse, Argonne, and I got there about 2:30 in the afternoon after the 11 o'clock armistice had been signed, 11 o'clock that morning. And I was the last one to report in. And so slept in a pillbox that night. The cooks were getting up ready to feed the company, so they let me have their hammock, which is made out of army blankets, stretched across this concrete pillbox. And I slept until morning. And morning we had enormous pancakes. The cooks saved up enough flour for that, and we had coffee and sugar, and I don't know what else we might have had for breakfast. But so I reported to the major in charge of the outfit, and he immediately sent me up to the front lines, gave me a horse. It was raining just terribly and muddy, awful up there. I put on a poncho and got on this horse. The horse knew the way, and we got up to the battalion headquarters up in the front lines and reported the major up there, and he turned around and sent me right back to the regimental headquarters where I had just come from a few hours before. And we stayed around there for a couple of days, getting ready to march up the front. And our platoons were the heads of the spearhead of the American Army. So we had to investigate every bridge and every culvert and every booby trap that might be along the way. And one of our lieutenants rode back and forth in a motorcycle sidecar. The rest of us all traveled on foot. And we come along and find a German helmet or a German saber along the ditch, and some fellow would pick it up and in his pack, and he'd carry it for a day or so, and then he'd throw it back down the ditch, and somebody else would pick it up. It got too heavy. And we went up into Germany and up on the Rhine River, across the Rhine River, and had a bridgehead area up there. The 32nd was in the front line of the bridgehead area, and the 2nd Division of Marines had the other half of the bridgehead area.
Well, Phil, during World War I, are you writing long letters to Hazel back in Louisville, Kentucky, or what's going on?
Oh, yeah. I wrote scads of letters, and my father found out that I wasn't getting the letters from home. I wrote, I traveled around so much. When I got up in Germany, since I was the last fellow joining the outfit, they sent me back to France to school. And I was back there, down there for 10 days or 2 weeks, something like that. I got back, and they had another corps school, so they sent me down to another school. And I came back, and they had another school for the carrying mans of animals, and so they sent me to that school. And so I didn't stay in one place very long. And finally my father sent a telegram to General Pershing, I have a copy of it, saying that Lieutenant Magner wasn't getting his mail and wanted to know why. So Pershing sent the letter down through channels through the Army, through the division, through the company, and so on and so forth to my captain, and asked me to reply, and I sent a reply back by channel clear back to my father in America through General Pershing. And soon after that, I finally settled down, and I got all the mail that gathered up, and I expect there was about a half a wash basket, or about a half a bushel basket full of mail from me, all my friends, all my Christmas mail, and so on and so forth. And it took me days to read it all, but I finally caught up with the mail and got the chance to read it.
Were you ever scared during this period?
I don't think so. I don't think I was ever in any grave danger. I got to the front lines after everything had quieted down. I only just missed it by a few hours, and I went across the back areas when the field artillery was still oiling and cleaning up their guns after they'd fired the last shells at 11 o'clock in that morning. Our infantry went over the top that morning, and some of the men were killed in foxholes up the front. We afterwards marched up and saw those, that's where that front line was. They were dug in some of the gravel pits along the roadway. I don't think I ever was in any great danger. The biggest danger I was in was in the chorus school one time. We were digging a mine. I was down underground about 40 feet straight down. And we yelled at some fellow up at the top to send some planks down. Instead of sending them down by block and tackle, he just threw them down the shaft. And I think one of those missed my head by about 3 or 4 inches. If I'd been hit with it, that'd been the end of me.
Yeah. Well, what happened after your duty on the Rhine, then, your Army career on the Rhine? Then,
well, I was transferred to the 313th Engineers and became motor officer, and lived in a little French town up there that probably hadn't changed in 300 years. And they didn't have any water supply, and the buildings were all side by side down the street. And
let's take it right from there, in the French town, and finish your occupation and back to the United States and marriage.
You going now?
Right.
All right. This little French town probably hadn't changed any in 300 years. And while I was there, we had, it was a school for the care and management of animals. And we'd go out in the daytime and work with a six-horse wagon and combat wagon. And we'd curry the horses and groom them and try horseback riding and so on and so forth. And we had stable guard at night. And we had strict orders not to let any of the horses lie down because they became so mussed up with in the stable that they were hard to clean the next day. So the guy go around with the pitchforks round and around the stable, and if he see any horse lying down, he'd give it a poke with the pitchfork and get it up on his feet again. I don't know whether you realize or not, but horses can sleep standing up. The joints of their legs will lock in place, and they can stand there with their eyes shut and sleep on their feet as well as lying down. Well, we stayed there and tried every trick of the trade, learned about horse diseases and so on and so forth. And when I got through with that school, I went back to up into Germany again, and was transferred back to 107th Engineers. And I say the adjutant was quite surprised to see me back there again. He thought he'd gotten rid of me. But I had been with a company of men from the Detroit area, and they loved their booze, and they were just a bunch of rounders. And so when I came back, they transferred me to another company, and there I was with college fellows and real high-type men, just different as day and night. So I got along fine with that group, and I came home with them from Germany. And we spent most of the time up there drilling and trips into coal plants and so on and so forth, and played volleyball with ice on the courts. Your hands would be so cold they'd just be numb, but you still play volleyball just the same. We had a cook's team and a second lieutenant's team and a teamster's team and so on and so forth. We had a lot of fun. We were quartered in a schoolhouse. There were 4 floors to the schoolhouse, and up in the top floor where the teachers would live with their families, and the lower floors were used for school purposes. Well, from there we finally came back to France, to Brest, and there got aboard a little ocean ship, about 500 feet long, a British ship, and came home on it to Philadelphia. At Philadelphia, my wife's brother met me. He'd been in the Marine Corps and had been, I know he'd been discharged at that time, but he knew I was coming. And I went down to Washington and got my discharge from the Engineer Corps. I could have gone home with the outfit to Michigan. They were a Michigan and Wisconsin outfit, but I chose to go to Washington and get discharged there. And they gave me 2 weeks to go home and see if I could find a job. When I got home, my father suggested that I get a job teaching school.
Phil, I think that we're getting ahead of ourselves here in one respect. We should go back and pick up your wedding day to Hazel, that tell us the details and so forth.
I was stationed at Camp Humphreys and tried to get a leave of absence, but they wouldn't give me one. But I noticed on the bulletin board that some officer had gotten a leave of absence to go home and get married. And I said, that's just exactly what I'm going to do. So I got put in an application for 3 days leave, and went home, went to Louisville, Kentucky, and was married there. And I had 2 days before and 2 days after, so I had a full week to get to Louisville and get back to Camp Humphreys. And I was married in Louisville, and we got on the train, went back to Washington. I'd already made preparation for a place for my wife to stay in Lorton, Virginia. She was Hazel Mae Harris. Her father had a grocery store within a few miles of my hometown years before, and she had been at the Lyceum course in Morris that very summer that I had gone to. We probably weren't very far apart, but I never had met her. I knew her sister and her brother-in-law, but I never had met her. So we went back to Lorton, Virginia, and I was on the rifle range at the time. And so when night came on, I would go down to Lorton, stay down there overnight. The people down there fixed a real nice meal for us and fixed up the dining room, just the 2 of us in their big dining room. And then in the morning, I'd go back to the artillery range, or the rifle range. I was going back one morning when a couple of Marines came by with a 4-wheel drive, 4-wheel steer ammunition truck. And I got up on the front seat. There's room up there for 4 people. And we hadn't gone down the road very far. They were sashaying back and forth across the road, and all at once we hit the edge of the road, and I went flying over the fence into the field, picked myself up, and started walking on down, because I had a time limit on reporting for duty. And these fellows yelled at me, wanting to know if I wanted to ride the rest of it. I said, no, I'm not interested anymore. I've had enough of that. So I reported to the artillery range, or the rifle range, and spent our time with my company there.
Well, now we can jump back ahead now to our seeking employment. You had 2 weeks after you discharged or before you discharged to look for employment.
You mean after I got back home from overseas?
Right.
Okay. When I got home from overseas, I reported at the Corps of Engineers office in Washington and came on to Louisville and picked up my wife there. Went up to northern Illinois, to Morris, Illinois, and went into Chicago and registered there to get a job teaching school. And there I found out that Wabash, Indiana needed a physics and chemistry teacher, and that just suited me fine. The salary was $1,300 a year. That was quite a little less than I had gotten as a second lieutenant of engineers, but that didn't make any difference. Jobs were pretty scarce in those days, and you couldn't be too particular about what you got. So I spent that summer. Dad wanted the house painted, so I took on the job of painting the house. Had some 40-foot ladders, and I remember they wouldn't reach. I used to get up on the top of the house and reach over the edge with 2 cans of paint and 2 colors of paint brushes to make green trim and white body of the house. Well, from there I came to Wabash that fall, and meanwhile my wife and I had gone to Chicago and had bought some household goods. And one of the first things we bought in Wabash was a kitchen cabinet from W.P. Jones and Son. And we still have some of that cabinet out here in our kitchen to this day.
This would be 1919 and 1920.
1919.
1919.
The fall of 1919 when school started in Wabash. That's when we came to Wabash.
Phil, excuse me. Who was the superintendent then, and what were the hiring procedures? Did you have physicals and applications and so forth?
Owen J. Neighbors was the superintendent of schools, and he had registered with this teacher in this teacher's agency in Chicago that he needed a physics and chemistry teacher in Wabash. So they notified me of 3 different locations, one in Cleveland and Case School of Applied Science, and this job in Wabash and one other job over in Illinois. But the one in Wabash paid $100 more than the other 2 offered, $1,300 a year, so I took the Wabash job. I'd gone to school with a lot of fellows from Wabash, Howard Plummer and Reg Woodard and John Beamer and Fred Van Buskirk and, I expect there was a dozen or so more that had gone to Wabash College when I was. So I was in territory that I knew a little something about. And came here and picked up the job of teaching in the high school. Down there on Hill Street at that time in the old building. I think the total enrollment was around 275 in those days. And while I was there in the first year, our son was born. Phil Jr. was born, and our second baby was on the way. And when the people where we stayed at McNamee's heard that the second baby was on the way, they couldn't stand that. They couldn't stand to have another baby born in that house, so they told us we'd have to get out. So I went out on Stitz Street and found a little house out there. The only modern thing in it was a furnace, and it wasn't properly installed. But I think we paid $2,800 for that house. And the first summer I dug a ditch to put in a drain for the kitchen and put in a concrete floor in the basement and generally improved the house as I could, bought storm windows and rock wool in the walls and so on and so forth. I remember when Phil Jr. went out there, he couldn't walk yet, and he got slivers in his knees and in his legs crawling around on the soft wooden floors out there. We didn't have any bathroom in the house. I installed a bathroom later on, and we got along all right. We got along in good shape.
Who was the principal of the high school and some of the teachers?
Maynard C. Darnell was the principal of the high school at that time, and Bess Bear was mathematics teacher, and Cornelia Blaney was the Latin teacher, and Stella Moore was the assistant principal and the civics teacher. And there's quite a few men that had come back. E.E. Barnhart had the commercial department, and T.R. Tewksbury had the English department. Leewell Carpenter had come back as the athletic coach, and I've forgotten what subject he taught beside that. And I can't think of some of the other teachers offhand, but I think we had about 13 or 14 teachers in the high school in those days.
Now you were living, before you moved on Stitt Street, you lived in the McNamee house down on Main Street, correct?
Right back at the high school.
Yes. Now, Mr. Honeywell also had a house on Main Street. Was he living there at that time?
Right next door.
Was he living in that house at that time?
Frank Plummer lived in that house at that time.
Yes. And where had Mr. Honeywell moved to?
Well, Mr. Honeywell, I think, lived up here on Wabash Street. I think he, forgotten what it is, right back of this, I don't know what number it is, about 250 North Wabash Street. He had modernized that home, and he had lived for a while next door to McNamee's, but Frank Plummer lived there. I remember they invited us over one night for supper, and they had cottage cheese with gooseberry jam on it. It was the first time I'd ever heard of such a thing. They call it, I don't know, had a special name for it. And so ever after, we always had cottage cheese and gooseberry jam from then on.
Now you continue your high school teaching career, and the family is growing. And now, how does Mr. Honeywell come into your life?
Well, I had been teaching high school for about 9.5 years, and one day R.J. McDaniel, who came out, I don't know what his job he had at the time, whether he purchasing agent or not, but he came out and he said they had a problem in the Honeywell company, and they'd talked to everybody, and nobody could solve the problem, and they wanted to know, as a last resort, whether the physics teacher could help them out. And I found out I could help them and solve the problem for them, and they were so delighted that Mr. Honeywell sent word to me soon after that he'd like to talk to me. So I went down to see him, and he said he had a opening in they're starting a research department for the Honeywell company here in Wabash. They didn't have any place else in the United States. And Paul Shivers was in charge of that, and he wanted to know if I'd like to be in charge of the laboratory.
Phil, what was the problem, and what year was this that you finally met up with Mr. Honeywell?
Well, the problem was they had a furnace control they called I forgot what the name was, but anyway, it was a new idea in a furnace control. The bulb lay on top of the firebox in the furnace, and if the water got low, this would overheat and shut off the furnace and shut the furnace down before then any damage was done to the furnace. But the trouble was that the thing would lie dormant there for a while, and all of a sudden the pressure would build up and the thing would explode and spoil their nice instrument, and they couldn't understand why. Well, I had learned in chemistry that when you boil a volatile liquid like they had in that, I've forgotten what it was, pentane or something like that, that you have to have some sharp objects in there to start the boiling smoothly. So I suggest they put the copper wool in this capsule, and so that's what they did, and everything worked perfectly, and they never had any more trouble with it.
Great. I now go on to the year was, have we covered the year? What year would that have been?
About 1920 was the year my son, Phil Jr., was born.
That you were helping on this research project for Honeywell. Okay, now you meet Mr. Honeywell and take it from there.
He said, now don't answer me right away. He thought I might turn him down. He says, you go talk to your wife and your family physician and your minister and anybody else you can think of, and the superintendent of schools and the principal of the high school. You said you go see what they think about it. Well, I went to the superintendent of schools, and he said right away that he thought that was a wonderful opportunity. And the principal of the high school said the same thing, and everybody thought I had a fine opportunity. And of course, they wanted me to take it up right away, and I did. Final exams were due within a few days, and I got started with the Honeywell company without finishing up the final exams. Wilberforce came in and took over where I left off and finished up that semester, and they got Roy Black to come and take my job as a physics and chemistry teacher in the high school. We were in the new high school building out on North Miami Street, and I had looked forward to quite a pleasant place to work. And of course, it was quite a surprise to me to think that Mr. Honeywell wanted me to work for him. When he asked me about salary, and I said, well, if you will pay me in the 3 months in the summer at the same rate at which I'm paid in the winter, why, we'll start there. Oh, he said he'd be glad to do that. I've forgotten what it was. But at the time, I was the highest paid teacher in the faculty of the high school. Some of the women teachers didn't like that very well, but offered right away and not even wait for the final exam, so I did. And so I went down, and they had a model shop, and Ray Launder and Jim Davis and Dave Thorburn and some of those fellows were making models, experimental models for the Honeywell company. So the laboratory had not been set up yet, but Paul Shivers had started getting it ready, and the original lab was up in the old Thrush building, I think it was, on South Wabash Street, where I think Mr. Garber has his office at the present time.
That would be on South Wabash Street, about a half a block south of Canal Street.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And we had a test room built in the old Wabash Cabinet building. We were in the basement there. And the experimental department of the shop was down there. And I had a little room, probably about 10 by 30, with our first laboratory. And they wondered if I would like an assistant of some kind in the laboratory. And Howard Worth was just graduating from school. He'd just been let out over at the drafting room. And Paul Shivers suggested that maybe I'd like to have him help me. So I said, I'd be fine. I had known Howard, and he had done some very excellent work in his later days in high school. One of the first things he did was to make a steam engine out of some castings I had, and I was quite impressed with that. And so he came to work for me, and he's getting along quite well. I've forgotten what his wages or salary might have been, but his wife, who worked the switchboard upstairs, Mary Alice Morrow, was quite delighted to think that he had this job. And so he proposed to her, and she said that no, she wasn't ready to get married, that he'd have to go to Purdue and amount to something before they get married. So after about a year's time, next fall, he went down and entered Purdue University and took electrical engineering down there and made quite a name for himself. He got H's, a thing I don't think they give anymore, but they gave at that time those who get the highest grades in various courses. And he came from Purdue with quite an excellent record and came back to Wabash thinking to pick up his job with me. And sure enough, it was waiting for him. And of course, he'd had those 4 years' experience down there in school, and he'd learned a lot of very worthwhile things as far as the Honeywell company was concerned. And About that time, the Honeywell plant was distributed in 4 or 5 different places in town, and Paul Shivers had talked Mr. Honeywell into the idea of building an addition at the old flour mill on Canal Street. So that was torn down, and a 3-story building was put up, brick building with concrete floors was put up, and that became the new experimental part of the Honeywell company. And the laboratory was in the basement. And we had a very nice laboratory, large rooms, and had a big a cold room, we called it. It was a enormous refrigerator with a one-room house inside of it. And in that one-room house, we would test various kinds of thermostatic controls, and we could turn on a fan outside and have a cold north wind blow on the house, or we could turn it off, or we could warm it up in summertime and test the Honeywell controls in that cold room, we called it. We had an ammonia refrigerator, and I learned a lot about refrigeration in that thing. We had another test room back behind where we tested humidity controls, and some of the first work on humidity controls for the Honeywell company were done here in Wabash. In fact, the humidity controls are still made here after all these many years of experimenting. We tried many kinds of fibers, wood, and so on, and we finally decided on using human hair. And today, human hair is the one that is used and is the most reliable of all the materials that are used for humidity controls. The Honeywell company still makes, I expect, hundreds of them every week, hundreds of controls that go all over the United States and foreign countries in the way of controls for humidity for various processes.
Phil, did they develop this human hair humidity control when you were in the lab?
I think the Honeywell company was a pioneer in this human hair humidity control. Some other companies used wood in the thin layers of wood, thin strips of wood, cones of wood, and cylinders of wood. And but I think Honeywell was the only one that used human hair, and it's been developed to quite a degree. That it's the method of handling it was we went to some of the literature, some of the German literature, and British literature and French literature, and read up on some of the early experiments, and finally came to the conclusion that we were on the right track. And human hair is still extensively used for a good, reliable control. Various instrument companies, but none of them would take an interest in his problem. But Mr. Honeywell saw it and saw some advantage in it, and set aside $10,000 to see what he could develop of this pyrometer that would tell the temperature of steel in a steel mill. As you know, some years ago when the turret top became popular, they were quite a loss to roll wide sheets of steel that would make turret tops, making all one piece. And so the American rolling mill at the U.S. Steel Corporation at Gary, Indiana, were willing to give this thing a trial. And so we made up some experimental pyrometers and installed them in that mill, 4 of them on a rolling mill. The mill was probably at least a quarter of a mile long. And you started with a slab of steel about 12 feet long, 4 inches thick, and about 2.5 feet wide. And you'd roll that out until there was a thin sheet, maybe 1,800 feet long, and in a coil. And from there, that was reduced down to the thickness necessary for a turret top for an automobile. Well, we developed this pyrometer. It was water cooled, and looked at the steel as it went by. Didn't touch it at all. In fact, we were 10, 12 feet away from the steel, and the photocells would register the amount of temperature that you had, and we'd put that on a chart recorder. We bought the recorders from Esterline Angus in Indianapolis, and we'd get a record, and we had several speeds on the recorder, so we could stretch it out into maybe the 1,200-foot length of steel would be recorded in 1 or 2 inches on the chart, or you might stretch it out over 3 or 4 yards if you wanted by changing the speed of the recorder. Well, we have put this in the Gary steel mill, and it worked fine. But in a day or so, they called us up and said, well, the pointer's all over the place, the thing isn't working. So we'd go back up to Gary and reset the thing, and a few more days, we'd get another report that it wasn't working right. So we knew something was wrong, and I had some reference books on photoelectric pyrometers, and I discovered in there that they said that the insulation on the photocell must be a very high grade. They use bakelite on these photocells. They're all right at the high levels, but at low levels, the bakelite would leak enough to show an indication on the recorder when there wasn't anything in front of the eye, we called it. So I fixed up a photocell with glass beads for insulation and sulfur base and a isolantite, a porcelain-like material. And we took it up to Gary, and it just worked perfectly. It did exactly what we wanted it to do. So from then on, we fixed up the other 3 and had 4 of them installed up there. And ordinarily, they have a group of men go up and down the steel mill with hand optical pyrometers, taking readings, and then they go back and chart it, and it might be several days before they'd learn the temperature of the steel that was being used in these turret tops. But with this method we had, you get instant indication of just what temperature you were using to finish the steel. And the steel people were delighted with it. So from that as a start, we branched out all over the Middle West. We got in nearly every steel plant that in the West, and did a very successful job. Our only problem was that the photocells were not uniform, and it took a lot of working with an electric furnace to get the instruments calibrated. That was the main thing, and probably the thing that probably made it fail in the end was the non-uniformity. But as far as in a fraction of a second, you could get an indication of the temperature of the steels that went by and put it on the chart, and you could study the chart and find out the rolling temperatures that you were using, a thing they hadn't been able to do before. Later on, Honeywell came out with a different type pyrometer. We had to give that up, although we had something like 150 of these installations.
Were they expensive to sell?
Well, they would sell from I expect $1,000 to $2,000 for an installation, depending on whether you got 1 or 4 or whatever you use. And as I say, the calibration was the difficult thing. We had a special furnace made, and that we could take the readings on, but about that time, the Minneapolis plant came out with a pyrometer based on a different principle, and I don't know whether it's still used or not. I haven't seen any indication of it, but it was easy to control. It wasn't as fast as the optical pyrometer that we used, but it's reliable and could be used where the photocells would change their characteristics, or there'd be different characteristics in a batch. Out of 100 photocells, we might find 35 or 40 that were fit to use and have to throw the rest of them away. The same way, there was a carbon filament lamp that we used in there, and we had to have that made specially for us up in Northern Illinois, some lamp making place. But as far as doing the job, it did an excellent job. But as I say, it was too expensive to calibrate it really and depend on it.
Was your salary going up all the while, Phil?
Yes. I started in at, I'd have to go look up in the figures, but about the time of the first of the year, or in December, Paul Chivers come to me and he said, well, I've asked them to increase your salary about $400 or $500 a year. A year or so later, he'd come to me and he'd say, I've got another raise for you. And I think some of the fellows got a little jealous because they didn't get the raise when I got it.
After you are developing this photoelectric cell, and then what project does the Honeywell lab go on to?
Oh, let's see. We would test devices that were sent in by different people who were interested. The humidity control, electrical humidity control, we did quite a little work on that. A German scientist had come to this country, a young fellow, and he had an idea. He took a sandblasted a glass tube about an inch in diameter and wound two nickel wires on it, about 10,000ths of an inch apart on that. And the moisture in the air would conduct electricity across between those two wires and give some indication on the instrument of what the relative humidity was. We went to quite an extent to make that, and I think the Honeywell company is still making that type of instrument. However, they've gone to gold instead of nickel. We use nickel, and we used platinum wire for a while, but that was too expensive. But they've gone to a gold type grid, and as far as I know, the company is still manufacturing that type of humidity control.
I was talking to Art Schenkel relative to this oral history project, and he was telling me and his recollections of working with the Austrian glassblower. Do you remember him and any incidents that might be of interest?
You mean glass blowing?
Yes, for that.
Mercury switch?
Yes.
Well, about the same time that I went with the company, we had a fellow by the name of Weigel,
yes,
who came here from a glass company, and at that time there was people making a mercury switch up in Elkhart, I believe it was, and so we got him to come here and make mercury switches. We didn't know too much about it. We thought possibly if we'd add some copper to the mercury that we could make it a better conductor of electricity. But that didn't work out very well. Although the copper would dissolve in the mercury, it would get thick and like clay eventually. So we just stuck to the mercury by itself. And this man Weigel was quite an excellent glass blower, and he made some distilling equipment for mercury, so we get pure mercury, and we filled these switches, and from then, later on, the Honeywell company bought out this Elkhart plant and bought their patents, and the Honeywell company today makes, I suppose, millions of mercury switches every year, and they've done a tremendous business in that. They're made at Minneapolis, I believe. I visited the plant up there, the department.
Well, we've gone through the two problems that you faced. Were you seeing Mr. Honeywell at all, or were you dealing with Mr. Shivers through Mr. Honeywell? Or what was the relationship there between the three of you? You were running the lab, and
well, I saw quite a little of Mr. Honeywell and got pretty well acquainted with him. He was very much interested in the problems we worked on and spent quite a little time down in the laboratory. And I got to visit with him, and he had some special problems of a kind. I remember during the Depression, we were down to about 5 people in the Honeywell plant here in Wabash, and so he suggested that I work on a plan he had for making brushless shaving cream. So I read up on the subject and got materials in and got perfumes in and so on, and started making brushless shaving cream. The idea was to make it in a capsule, very much like olive oil is made. And when you got ready to shave, you just nick the capsule with a razor blade and squeeze this little gelatin capsule all on your face and rub it in and shave, wash it off, and you didn't have to have a brush. You didn't have to carry soap with you. And we just got nicely started on that, and I made some samples and gave them to some of the fellows that were there, and they tried it out, and I tried it myself, worked fine. But business came back about that time. I think it was only a couple months we worked on that. Business came back with a bang and just kept hooping up, so we never did get back to making brushless shaving cream. But that was one of his pet ideas.
Were there other projects that you were working on in the lab, Phil, that you can remember with Mr. Honeywell or under his direction?
I think one of the most interesting problems we worked on was when the war came on. I know I'm skipping some other things, but...
we'll skip back to those. We'll get back to the other places.
Okay. The war came on in 41, and the Honeywell plant became a part of the defense unit of the United States. And we took on making telescopes for gun sights. We made them for airplanes. We made them for trench mortars. We made them for naval craft and naval guns of all sizes. And that started in with a very simple type of gun sight and developed to the point where we were making reticles the size of silver dollars. And with 2 widths of lines, the centered lines are very fine, only about 0.3 of a thousandth, and the heavy lines out from there were about 3 or 4 thousandths wide. And the trick was to make those reticles make the fine and the coarse line all at one time, and that was quite a trick. The Navy wanted that, and this reticle blank was not flat. One side was concave, and the other side was flat. And I expect we made $2 million worth of reticles in the time of the war. And when we started out, we would ship these to Minneapolis, and in Minneapolis they would install them into these different gun sites. And but our difficulty was that we'd send up a batch of reticles. We had about 100 people working in the reticle shop. And at Minneapolis, they could only use a few of them. Well, the thing got to be very critical. Some of those reticles were $4 and $5 a piece, just a little piece of glass about as big as a dime, optical glass. Well, they sent me up to Minneapolis to see what was wrong, see if I could solve the problem. Well, I spent several days up there, seeing them assembled and so on, and couldn't see anything, couldn't discover a thing that was wrong. But coming home one night, we came down to a department that was shut down, and the fellow who was that I was with said, "This is where we wash all those reticles we use in the gun sights." He said, "We wash them in I've forgotten what it was. Oh, it's trisodium phosphate, so on and so forth." I said, "Well, don't you know how delicate that optical glass is? Don't you know that it can't stand that kind of treatment?" And I convinced him around it then and there. And with that as a start, he got busy and got some fellow to come over and load up all these sacks of chemicals that were in pliofilm bags and took them out and dumped them. I said, "Those reticles don't need cleaning and washing like that. When we get through them, they're ready for assembly." Well, we were getting about a third of good radicals, and the rest of them were just being junked. Well, from then on, our acceptance at Minneapolis went up to 93 and 94%. And the trouble was they were ruining up there trying to clean them. They weren't.
They weren't helping you.
Oh, they weren't helping at all. weren't doing any good at all.
Phil, let's go back. Say the late 20s now. You're working in the lab, and depression is coming on. And do you have any feeling for it, or what is happening in the factory and the manufacturing end? And take us through the depression.
I don't know just what you have in mind.
Obviously during the depression, the production slowed down and orders stopped. And tell me what you did and who was left. You said there was only 5 left in the factory, and so tell us what happened from that era that you felt that business was going down, and what did you do, and so forth.
Well, these 5 people, I think 2 or 3 of them are watchmen, and Miss Walrod and Mr. Honeywell and Paul Shivers and I are about the only ones left down there out of the whole crew. And some of our best machinists got jobs out of town, and but when business came back, I don't know what brought it back particularly, but we got into a line that required our efforts. And some of these fellows were a little ticklish about it. Some of them lived in Peru. And I know a couple of those fellows drove up here every morning from Peru to work in the Honeywell plant and drove back down to Peru at night to stay. In fact, some of those fellows did, I don't know, there may be some out the Honeywell plant that are doing that yet. I think Ramsey out there probably still lives down in Peru, and he's been driving back and forth for years.
When you got down to the 5 people, now how long did this depression last? Was it years or?
No, it didn't last more than a couple of months, I don't believe. 2 or 3 months. Then things started to pick up, and thing has grown from that as the start. And then the war came on, and we had tremendous activity. We started this reticle shop in Wabash. Not Dave Thorburn, but I don't think it was Dave. Came down here from Minneapolis, had an idea on how to build reticles. And we started in an experimental way with 2 girls and 2 men. And we tried to learn the art of making reticles by a photographic method. There was 2 ways to make a reticle. A reticle in a gun sight, it's got lines across it, maybe just a cross line like in a sextant or something of that kind. But as the war went on, they wanted more and more complications. They wanted lead lines and elevation lines, so when you got through, the pattern looked more like a Christmas tree on there than it did just a couple of cross lines. And the size of the reticles became greater and greater, and until the one made about the size of a silver dollar, we made that for the Navy for an anti-aircraft gun. And I expect at the close of the war, we were probably making 50 or 60 different kinds of reticles for gun sights of various kinds. The war probably had a lot to do with our growth. We had 3 generations working in the shop. We had the grandmother and the mother and the son of several families working side by side in the shop.
Phil, I hate to keep getting back to the depression, but I'll just ask you some specific questions. Was your salary cut during the depression?
No, my salary wasn't cut at all, and I don't remember that. Well, it may have stayed the same a while, but Mr. Honeywell had the habit at Christmas time of going around and giving a few fellows maybe $100 or $200 or $300 for Christmas presents, and he did that several times for me, and all unexpected, of course. But for some reason or other, somebody got into it, either the government or somebody, said that couldn't be done anymore. So we didn't have any more bonuses, but my salary increased. I don't recall now what it was when I last worked with the company. I'd have to look at the records. I've got it all written down out there.
Did you get to know Mr. Honeywell fairly well by this time? Did you have any observations? Had he ever expressed any particular philosophies relative to running the country and the business recession and so forth? Give me some observations of your impression of Mr. Honeywell during this period.
I got to know Mr. Honeywell especially well when he built the Honeywell Memorial Community Center in Wabash. I was slated to go to Minneapolis and head up the physics department up there in their new experimental plant. They had somebody in charge of the chemistry department, but they offered me $100 more a month if I would come and take charge of it. But my children, my two boys were in the service, and they were just coming back, and my daughter was here, and I just didn't want to leave Wabash. I wanted to stay here. So Mr. Honeywell just before the war had started the Honeywell Community Center and had built up quite a stock of brick and wire for laughing and steel and so on and so forth. So he went right ahead with that during the war on a small scale. But when the war was over, he asked me if I would like to go down and supervise the construction down there. So I was called the supervisor of construction. He fixed me up with an office down there, and later it was his office, and with a big stack of blueprints where I took over down there. And he said, now you probably only have to spend an hour a day down here, and then you can come back up to the plant and work up here. Well, I found that if I stayed down there an hour and got things started, that in the next hour everything would backtrack and it wouldn't make any progress. So I soon saw I had to spend a full 8 or 9 hours a day down there to make any impression on it. But I got to know him quite well. I suppose on Saturday, quite often, he would come in about noon, and at quitting time, we'd quit at noon on Saturday, and he'd come in with Miss Walrod, and we'd sit down there in the lobby of the Honeywell building, and he'd recount some of the early experiences he had had as a boy. He told about one experience that he went down to Georgia. His father had a citrus grove down there, grew grapefruit and oranges, and I've forgotten what year it was, but and associated with him was a man who was a hypnotist and a man who was a spiritualist. The three of them had this place, and Mr. Honeywell used to sit around the fire down there at night and listen to these fellows tell of their experiences. And but the frost came along, I don't know what year it was, and killed all the citrus fruit. So his father came back to Wabash and had a glassed-in, what do you call it out here? A garden, you know, they have in the wintertime with the
greenhouse.
Greenhouse, yeah.
Right.
We had some greenhouse out here, and he put out some apple orchards and went into the business of growing fine apples and making cider. And Mr. Honeywell tells of a story of about the cider. His mother would entertain the women from the missionary society out at her house at night. And Mr. Honeywell, as a boy, thought it'd be fun to put some croton oil in the cider and see what would happen. So he put some croton oil in the cider, and his mother fed it to these women. And on the way home, you know what happened. They were just sick as could be. I don't know whether he got caught out or he was blamed for it or not, but that's just one of his pranks. And he would tell us about that. And then somebody here in town was selling bicycles. They called them safety bicycles. Both wheels were the same size, like they have standard size bicycles today. They had before big high wheel bicycles with a little wheel behind, a big wheel, you know. And so he had this agency for this company, and he went down into Arkansas and had a territory down there where he would sell these bicycles to the folks down there. Well, he was down there, and he'd put on a show. He'd do all kinds of tricks with these bicycles, and stand on the seat and sit on the handlebars and all sorts of tricks. And while he was down there, he met a fellow who was a hypnotist. I never had much thought. I just thought hypnotism was kind of a joke, but he kind of convinced me that there was something really to it. So this fellow, Mr. Honeywell, got this fellow to tell him about hypnotism and how to do it. And so one night, out in front of the folks down in this little town, they found a Negro boy who would agree to be hypnotized. So Mr. Honeywell got busy and hypnotized this boy and had him do various things. And one thing that he thought the boy wouldn't do unless he hypnotized, he asked him to go up and hit some fella on the side of the face and to slap him. Well, that was an unheard of thing for a Negro boy to do that to a white man. But this fellow went up and did it, and Mr. Honeywell saw he was in trouble, so he took the boy into the back end of the store, and he worked with him a long, long time to get him out of this trance, this hypnotism. And he told us about that one of these noon hours when we were down there sitting around in the front room. And another thing he told about his father, someone was interested in getting citrus fruits from California. He heard they were growing them out there, so he went out as a buyer to buy some fruit. And he went out there, and there were a bunch of people out there, and they were bidding on different citrus orchards. And he saw one especially nice citrus orchard, and he bid on it and packed up a box car. I expect it was a refrigerated box car, and had it sent to Chicago. But the sad thing about it was, by the time they got to Chicago, the citrus fruit was all spoiled. It was the kind that couldn't be shipped. These other fellows knew the kind that could be shipped, and that's what they were buying. So that didn't go over very well. But he told us about that. That was one of his experiences as a young fellow. And when, in the early days of his experience in Wabash, he was just a plumber. And one of his favorite things was hot water heating plants. And he did quite a little to promote that in Wabash. He had, a dozen different homes in Wabash that he had put in hot water heating plants, installed the furnace, and so on and so forth. And he didn't have a car on those days, and he would go down the street, usually all dressed up with a white collar and a white shirt and good clothes on. And when he'd go in to do the plumbing, well, he'd put these and hang them up someplace and do the plumbing. Then he'd clean up and go down the street with this pack of tools on his shoulder, rolled up in a canvas tool carrier. But and later on, when the Honeywell company developed a circulating pump for hot water systems, we went out and installed hot water pumps on nearly all these hot water systems he'd installed as a young fellow in the Wabash. And when he was a young man, early in the business, some fellow came to him with the idea of a mercury generator, so-called. It was a device you put on a hot water system that would build up pressure in the system and circulate the water much better than it would in a normal plant. Well, he started this, and then somebody came to him with the idea of a thermostat and a damper motor. So he took up to got a thermostat and built the thermostats here in Wabash and the damper motors. And he thought he could assemble these damper motors in Wabash. So he bought the parts and he brought them here and had just a few fellows. I think R.J. McDaniel was one of the first fellows that worked on that thing. And they assembled them, and out in he got all kinds of calls from his customers that they would stick in certain places and wouldn't work like they should. Well, he saw he was in hot water. He had shipped a lot of them out of the city to other people, and so he sent word to all these people to send in their damper motors. They were operated by heavy weights on a chain. He had them send those in and had them, he found out what was wrong. He hadn't relined the bearings on the shafts, and he just assembled them, and the wooden bearings were tipped at an angle so that the shafts would stick after a while. And so he sent word out to all his customers to send them in. Well, they sent so many in that he was broke. And he hobbled around Wabash all bent over with 2 canes, had arthritis, and he was in bad shape. But he found some fellow, Kenneth Roby was the fellow he found. Kenneth Roby was running a battery shop here in Wabash, storage battery shop. And he got Kenneth Roby to come over to the plant and tell him what was wrong with these motors. And Kenneth said, well, you need to line ream those bearings after you get them assembled to make them work right. So he called them in and repaired them and sent them back out, and they just worked perfectly. And from then on, he was on the way in the heat regulating business. That was his second item. The first item was this heat generator with a mercury in it, and the next item was the thermostat with a damper motor. Then he went to a clock wound motor, a spring, a big heavy spring. And you go down and wind that, I guess, once a day or every 2 or 3 days, and it would store up enough energy in the spring that operate the damper motor then for the next day or so.
Did Mr. Honeywell ever talk anything other than business to you? Did he ever interest politics or community affairs?
I don't recall that he ever did. He during the war or before the war, he became interested in chow dogs, and he had a farm out where the Honeywell Gardens are now, a farmhouse out there, and he thought it'd be nice to fix up that farmhouse and raise chow dogs. So he got the farmhouse fixed and got it ready, and about then the Depression came along. And he had Floyd Webb and some of those fellows working for him. And so instead of stopping there, why, they fixed up the Honeywell Lodge out there. And Floyd was out of work and in pretty bad shape physically and mentally. But he gave him a job out there, and they got busy, and he kept Floyd and 5 or 6 retired people who probably wouldn't have a job, just be sitting around the fireplace. Got them out there and built that Honeywell Lodge. And with that as a start, he expanded that into Honeywell Gardens. And in 1940, he had a 4-state festival out here at the Honeywell Garden. He had all those flower beds planted and hedges and evergreen trees, and really fixed the place up, and had the governor of Indiana come up here for one of his celebrations. Had all the Boy Scouts go out there and camp for him, and he had General Gillette from Culver Military Academy come down here to visit, and he had a painting display, and he had a great time. But the war was coming on in 41, and he got this garden festival started just before the war started. And He also had talked to Wilbur Ford, had talked about a community building. The Fords had decided that they would take their old Case bakery down catty corner from the courthouse and fix it up for a community service building with Cecil Mills in charge. The old building had been condemned, and Wilbur Ford and his family had decided they would fix up that old building. And just about ready to start when Mr. Honeywell called in Wilbur one day and he said, "What did you have in mind up there?" And Wilbur told him. He said, "I'm ready to build a community center now." He said, "When the people came to me several years ago, said I wasn't ready, and I turned them down, but I'm ready to build one now." He said, "My first wife has died, and I'd like to build it as a memorial to her." And he told Wilbur what he had in mind. And they got A.M. Strauss from Fort Wayne to come down here and make some preliminary plans. And the original idea was to have the south wing for the young people in town, roller skating and basketball and so on and so forth. And then he thought, well, he ought to make some effort to take care of the older folks. So that's what the north wing developed into. So he got Strauss and his engineers to design the building for him. And he got started about 1940, I think it was. Got started the building. So the building was pretty well along when the war came on in 41. The walls were up and the roof was on, but the interior of the building was not, there's no floors and no laths and no plaster. The inside and the front doors were just big slabs of Celotex, so that he got a good start. That was all. And in his original plans, he intended the food service down there was to be just much like a church service. A few people would come in for a few hours and set the tables and serve a meal and then clean up and go home, and they'd come back another week and start up again. As time went on, that idea didn't seem to be very practical. And so he went out onto the east side down there and started digging holes in the basement. And before he got through, he had enlarged that hole, I think, 6 or 7 times. When he finally got through and thought he had enough space for his dining room. So it developed into a week-round affair. And he built in refrigerators and dishwashing equipment, and an office and a storage room and refrigeration room and so on and so forth. So really the east of the building down there is all basement for all these extra things that he needed to make a successful food service.
Was Mr. Honeywell at this time then, was he getting away from the manufacturing business and turning more to the community affairs?
I think he always had community affairs in mind. Now, in the winter time, he always went to Florida for about 3 months, but he always kept in close contact with what was going on in Wabash. And when he was in Wabash, I think he came down to the plant nearly every day and checked in on things. He had a lot of irons in the fire. Down in Florida, that makes a whole story in itself, some of the things he did there. And some of the hobbies he had, like motion pictures, were a great thing with him. He spent a lot of time on motion pictures for the Committee of 100, both here and in Florida.
How would you describe Mr. Honeywell's personality?
Well, he had his good days and his bad days. I see him when he was the most likable kind of a chap. You wouldn't want a nicer fellow around. Then I see him so mad that he stamp his feet and he just fly to pieces. I remember one time the hedge out at the golf links there on the Chippewa Road, there's a power line goes over there, and the power company went out there and trimmed all those trees down like they do all over Wabash, but they didn't say anything to Mr. Honeywell about it. And he called in Mr. Hartman, and I never saw a man get such a lacing in all my life. I had to stand there and take it. I couldn't believe. And he had Mr. Hartman in tears, and he just thought, Hartman just thought he was doing his own business and didn't think he had to ask Mr. Honeywell to do it. And Mr. Honeywell said, now I know what this will do to me. It'll put me in bed for 3 or 4 days. And sure enough, he was in bed for 3 or 4 days after that upset. And there were other times when you couldn't have been around a nicer fellow. I'd say most of the time. But he knew when he lost his temper just what it would do to him. It just put him in bed for 2 or 3 days or a week, depending how bad he got upset.
Did you ever travel with Mr. Honeywell on business trips?
Yes. He took me to Minneapolis one time with him. I've forgotten just what the occasion was. He just wanted to show me around, and we called in. We stayed at Willard Huff's house that night, and visited with Mrs. Huff and Willard, and I think the 2 children were at school someplace, and we had a nice visit there, and he took me out to the plant and introduced me to all the folks out there. I've forgotten just what special thing we went up there for, what anything special. Maybe he just took me along to show me the Minneapolis plant.
Did Mr. Honeywell have any unusual personal habits or characteristics that you remember?
Oh, I don't know that he had any. He's a remarkable man in a lot of ways. He started with almost nothing, I would say, and I think his biggest ability was to gather men around him who could do the things that he wanted done. He knew he couldn't do it all himself, but he gathered fellows like Paul Shivers and Jim Davis and Ray Launder and those fellows around him, Kenneth Roby especially, and Phil Lobb. Phil Lobb was a great loyal fellow back in the days of the heat generator, and I don't know who some of the other fellows might have been, but I think he was a great fellow at forming an organization of some kind, an organization that would click and get the results that he wanted.
How about some of these people? How about Mose Worth now? You knew him when he was a little boy. You knew Mose all his life. And tell us about Mose.
I remember seeing Mose Worth the first time over on Falls Avenue. He was, I suppose, in the 5th or 6th grade in school. And he was hooping and yelling, and later on I had him in high school. And he didn't care much whether school kept or not. I remember he had an old Ford, and one afternoon, he decided he and John Wire and some of the rest of them would go up to Lucan's Lake and go swimming. So they just thumbed their nose at Mr. Darnell and jumped in the car and went up to Lucan's Lake. And when they got back, of course, Mr. Darnell had them all fired from school. And I don't know what they had to do to get back in, but they got back in. And so Mose grew up in kind of he was a cheerleader in high school. And, well, I don't think he got down to serious things till Mary Alice Morrow came along, and she got him to settle down and go to Purdue and become a real engineer. Mose was the first man I had in my laboratory when I went with the Honeywell company, and I saw Mose develop from just a boy until to a mature man. During the war, he had an ambition to be a head of the Honeywell company, and I think sometimes he didn't care how many head and shoulders he stepped on to get there. I don't know whether I should tell that or not.
How about Ray Launder?
Ray Launder was a nephew. Let's see.
He was your stepbrother.
He's a step. Ray Launder's mother was Mark Honeywell's father's first wife, I believe, something like that. That was the reason. So Ray was related to him. Now Ray was busy with other things, but when the war came on, when the experimental department, Ray came in and made many of the models that the company worked on.
Was Ray good at this particular phase?
Oh yeah, he was an excellent craftsman, and he and Jim Davis and Dave Thorburn especially could turn out a piece of equipment that just beautifully done. They just had the knack, and when they got through, it worked. It did what it was supposed to do, and I suppose they made, I don't know, dozens and dozens of models of various devices that were sent in.
How about Paul Shivers?
Paul was quite a remarkable man. He had grown up, I think, mostly by his own efforts. He had, I think he had started a small way. I don't know, I didn't know Paul until he came to me and won't know if I wanted to work with him at the Honeywell company. But Paul was always very kind and thoughtful as far as I was concerned. He would have his bad days, his good days. Some days he couldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole, and other days he was just the perfect gentleman. I suppose everybody has days like that.
How about the merger when they merged? Do you remember anything there?
Well, Mr. Honeywell told us about the merger. He had gone out to California, I think to San Francisco, to a heating and ventilating convention of some kind. And of course, the Minneapolis company was separate from the Honeywell company, and they both had exhibits out there. But it looked like they were working on somewhat along the same lines, and coming back, he talked to one of the men from, I think, one of the Sweats, from the father, talked to him and said, why don't we join forces instead of fighting each other in this game? And they both thought it was a good idea and decided to merge the two companies, and that's what started it all.
Do you remember anything? Were you active, Phil, when the plant was unionized? Union that was organized in the plant?
I don't remember we ever had a union in the plant.
Possibly would have been when you.
Well, it was after I left the plant. Yeah. I don't think it was unionized at the time that I was with the company. I don't think that was happened until they built the new plant out the west part of Wabash.
Mrs. Honeywell, first Mrs. Honeywell. Do you remember her?
Oh yes. When I first came to Wabash, somebody, I think Dr. Little, induced me to come down to the Presbyterian Church and teach a class of boys about 9 or 10 years old. And I went down there, I think probably in 1919, and a little early. And right next to where I had these boys, Mrs. Honeywell, the first Mrs. Honeywell, had a class of girls about the same age as the boys. So she introduced herself, and I told her who I was, and we visited and talked about.
The phone rang there, Phil, and we were talking about the first Mrs. Honeywell. You met her in church?
Oh, yes. she was a member of the Presbyterian Church, and I suppose Dr. Little had induced her to teach this class of girls. Dr. Little was a minister when I first came to Wabash, and I think he probably induced me to teach the Sunday school class, if I remember right. Some of those boys I later had in high school, and I remember Bill Gray was one of them. I won't tell you all the experience I had with Bill.
How about that?
Fred Squires and Albert DeArmond and all those young fellows that belonged to the Presbyterian Church in those days.
Phil, this is the first Mrs. Honeywell. What did she look like? I understand she was a very extremely pretty woman.
I don't know if I know her very well, except in my association in school. Well, when Dr. Little died, Nevin Schaff and his wife came to Wabash. He was our Presbyterian minister, and I think the Honeywells kind of took them in tow and made them feel at home. And I think probably the Schaff spent quite a little time at the Honeywell cabin up at Lake Woelfel. I don't think I ever got to know Miss Honeywell too well. I didn't have near the association I had with Mr. Honeywell.
How did Marvel Walrod fit into the picture?
I don't know just how she got in, except that she was a senior in high school, and I've heard her tell part of the story. She became Mr. Honeywell's secretary, I think, soon after she finished high school, and was his secretary all through the years then. That was her desk right there.
She's considerably younger than